Hello and welcome to another short art reflection as we journey through Lent together. I've decided to talk to you today about a small drawing. I say small, it's about the size of an A4 sheet of paper, and it's done using pen and brown ink. It's by the Dutch artist Rembrandt, and you could find it in the collections of the British Museum in London. You might wonder that I've chosen a drawing by Rembrandt. There are many large oil paintings that I could have picked, or I could have picked a far more important in many ways series of prints. He was a great printmaker as well as a great painter, but he was also a great draftsman. And I think Rembrandt's drawings are among some of the most interesting of his works. I also thought it was quite nice to think of something slightly smaller this week. If you've been following these talks as a series, then you would have realised that we've thought about an enormous photograph, we've thought about an oil painting by Rubens, another oil painting with text in it by Glenn Ligon. We looked at a building a few weeks back, and last week we looked at a sculpture. So to turn to drawing tonight seemed to fill a gap, I think, in the types of media that we have looked at. Drawings are often very personal in the work of an artist, especially in the period in which Rembrandt was working. So this is from around about 1652 to 56. The exact date isn't written on it, but we can tell that from the sort of style and from dating the paper that this work is done on. That period would have been a time when drawing was really a medium of preparation. It was the process you used to try to come up with a final composition that you would then translate into oil painting, or perhaps into an engraving or an etching on a metal plate in order to make a print. And we know that Rembrandt did a lot of both of those things. So drawings are often seen as being either very preparatory or very personal. They remain as sketches, and often they're not intended for public display. Now, in the collections of the British Museum, you would be very unlikely to find this on the wall if you went there once lockdown is over. But you would find it in the prints and drawings room there. Drawings are very light sensitive. They rarely make it onto the walls, certainly for not long periods of time, at any rate. But the British Museum prints and drawings room is open to the public, so do go and have a look at it at some point. There's something very personal and intimate, I think, about poring over a small-scale sketch by a very famous artist, and really seeing the intricacy of all of that pen and ink work that Rembrandt has been doing there, and the sort of spontaneity of the line. You can see where he's been slightly more certain and slightly less certain in what he's trying to draw, whereas in an oil painting you might make sure that more detail was shown in the foreground and the background was slightly less detailed or paler in colour. Here you can see the back prow of the ship leading towards the tiller is actually thicker in the ink line than some of the parts of the ship in the foreground. So some of those sort of idiosyncrasies come out, I think, in drawing, and the spontaneity of that as the artist is sort of working out what they're trying to do that perhaps you don't see in a finished oil composition. And I think that's really, really interesting. It gives us a real insight into the way that Rembrandt's mind was working. I think this also gives us an insight not just into his technique, but to the way that he was thinking about the story that this small drawing is based on. It's to do with the narrative of Jesus walking on water, which we take from Matthew chapter 14. I'll read you a little bit of it. So Jesus has sent the disciples off on their own. It's shortly after the feeding of the 5,000. He's gone up a mountainside to pray, and he sends them off in a boat. When evening came, he was alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to the disciples, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." how Rembrandt gives us this scene, and he sort of pushes everything into the one picture plane. You can see the sort of the waves around the boat there. You can see that it is caught in the wind. You can see Jesus having walked out on the water, but he's not some way away from the boat at this point. He's up right next to it because Rembrandt's at great pains to come in close to the subjects of the picture. And you can see Jesus there pulling Peter up out of the waves, and another disciple in the boat may be about to climb out over the side, or perhaps he's going to reach out to try and help Peter and Jesus back into the boat. I think there are 5 disciples there in the boat. One seems to be holding an oar at the side, one's trying to climb out, there's another one to his left and another one to his left, and then if you look backwards into the boat, you can see one sort of pushed up against the back of the boat, perhaps taken aback by the events or thrown back by the wind and the waves. So 5 disciples in the boat, Peter in the water, and Jesus walking on the water. All of that sort of truncated into this one little scene. And I think it's really interesting the way that Rembrandt has done that. He's come in very close. He's not at pains to show us the breadth of the lake, which some artists have been when they've used this subject. He's not trying to create the effect of the storm so much as to get in on the very human subjects that he is depicting. Rembrandt was very interested in the human face, in the human figure, in the real humanity of things, rather than presenting people as sort of classical ideals or heroes. He was very interested in showing their human qualities. And he does that with Peter clutching at Jesus' arm quite desperately and looking up at him, and the slightly worried, anguished faces of the disciples peering out of the boat. So even though there's not a huge amount of detail here, I think Rembrandt seems to give us a real picture, a real sense of the emotive events that have been taking place. Now, this was a period in the 1650s when Rembrandt himself was going through a slightly choppy time, partly to do with women, partly to do with money. And I wonder if it might be tempting to see this as slightly autobiographical. Perhaps Rembrandt particularly relates to this story because he feels himself caught up in waves that he's struggling to emerge from. Perhaps he himself feels like Peter, as though he is drowning. That is conjecture, of course. It's very hard to know how Rembrandt would have responded to this picture, or to this subject, or why he particularly chose to depict it. But it's tempting to think about it slightly biographically and to wonder. Either way, I think these are a sort of meditation on the events of Matthew chapter 14. And when I look at the picture, the thing that really strikes me most about it is if you can see those quite directional lines across the diagonal of the back of Jesus, and then at a right angle to that, cutting across level with his shoulders, and then the light that seems to emerge from around that. It makes a cross shape, doesn't it? It's as though we've got an image there of Jesus carrying his cross. It looks a little bit like a scene from the Way of the Cross or the Stations of the Cross, Jesus carrying his cross there. Now, we know that this is set on Lake Galilee. It's before the events of the Passion of Jesus. It's before he goes to Jerusalem. But I actually think that it tells us something very deeply theologically true about what Jesus is heading to, even at this point. The words of Matthew 14 are quite telling, I think. Peter's words, "Lord, save me," says Peter. And Jesus does. He saves him from the water. He reaches down and he pulls him out. And yet that image of being pulled out of a pit, pulled out of the waves, saved from drowning, seems to come to stand for what Jesus would later do for Peter and everybody else on the cross, in saving us from the sin that seeks to engulf us, the doubt that seeks to disrupt our faith and our relationship with God. At the end of the event, the disciples declare, don't they, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Jesus, of course, knows full well that being the Son of God involves setting his face to Jerusalem, heading towards the cross. Even here on Lake Galilee, he's preparing his disciples for the events that will have to take place in the run-up to his crucifixion. He's preparing them for what the Son of God will have to do. Yes, he's a saviour, not just from the waves, but from doubt and from sin. And it's the cross which ultimately will be the way in which he will save them. So all of this sort of sketchiness, it seems like a form of annotation. I think Rembrandt is almost thinking the story out on paper, using his pen and ink. I like to see it almost as a form of doodle. You can see different types of shading. And I think that sort of level of slight uncertainty, perhaps, in the way that this drawing has been made, can speak to perhaps our sense of doubt and uncertainty as we try to step out in faith, the way that Peter did, wanting to be confident, but not being quite sure of perhaps ourselves, perhaps of God, against the waves and the wind that threaten to distract us. Jesus, in contrast, is completely certain. He has absolutely no doubt in what he has been called to do, or in the way that his Father will see those events through to completion, not ending on the cross, but ending with the resurrection and Jesus' return to heaven and the salvation of all of us because of that. Jesus, save me, says Peter, and he will, because he is the Son of God.